So what you see up on the screen is what we started out with in the GIS database that shows in color coding the year that those walls were installed and what location. You can see that's pretty much broken up by what we called or characterized as zones within each of the neighborhoods. Yes, sir.
You're aware that we're from Birch Store Isles,
Yes, sir.
and most of what you see here is PGI.
Yeah, I apologize. The green on that graphic.
We're the little one down in the right-hand lower corner.
I understand.
And would you just make sure that your entire presentation is oriented around us and not the whole thing in general? Because what happens in PGI is very important to us as Punta Gorda citizens, but we're mostly concerned here with that little right-hand lower corner.
Okay. Sure. Well, I'm starting out with walking you through what we did as a whole. We looked at the program as the city's program, whether it be one neighborhood or the other, but certainly we can address any questions that are specific to you folks. And I do apologize that the color just so happens to not pop off the page here, but we do have a very light kind of faint green shown there to highlight your area, which is, it happens to be somewhat newer than some of the PGI walls. So. Then on the graphics, the plots here to the right, you see original seawall installation by year, as well as broken down by zone within each neighborhood. And again, this was just really what we use as a starting point or jumping off point to understand how old these walls are now. Moving forward, we also took into consideration the city's current annual inspection process and how these walls are reviewed on that annual basis, what criteria they're using, and so on. So this is just a snapshot from the report, a summary table just defining what the city standards were. 0 being considered excellent, the wall is in new condition. 1 being good, minor problems but nothing to harm the structural integrity. 2 is failure. 3 moderate. 4 serious, and 5 of course failed. So we really relied upon the city's records on when the walls were installed, as well as the most recent annual inspection assessment, which was conducted in March of 2007, or completed, I should say, in March of 2017. So the table on the right-hand side, you'll see that is data pulled from that 2017 assessment, wherein we've broken it down by neighborhood. So for BSI, 9,041 feet were considered excellent, 72,698 considered good. And you can see that the bulk of those walls in your area seem to be in good shape.
And I'm going to jump in here with some of the questions. One of your comments was the question about why 2018 and 2019 data was not considered in the analysis. And that is, in fact, exactly the reason, is we only had city inspection through 2017, so we didn't do the inspection. We cut our analysis off at the last inspection that the city had completed.
Right, and Irma came through in September of that year, and so, of course, all hands were on deck to work on that effort.
So can I ask the question, of the linear foot in BSI that you identify here, were seawalls that were replaced as a result of Irma taken into consideration for that?
Yes, so the walls that were replaced as a result of Irma throughout that process, we just deemed as a 0, which was in excellent condition because they were all installed in 2018-19.
Okay.
Yeah.
But that didn't go back to the rest of the walls because they had not been inspected yet.
Right. Okay. So moving forward again, this is that same analysis just shown in graphical plan view. You can see where we really just tried to get a sense for where these walls were considered excellent versus where they were seeing failures, and whether there was any nexus to that. And this is just a good graphic of that. Once we had an understanding of the age of the walls, their original installation, we went to looking at breaking it down a little bit further, looking at what the city we characterize as eras. So the original wall installation has a certain era. Then over time, I think in the early, 2000s, they moved to the use of epoxy-coated rebar, and then in 2010, 2011, moving to the MMFX. And so we've tried to also break down the data by those three kind of categories, and that's what you see here. The green and the orange, those data came primarily from the GIS records, as well as some additional data that the city kept on file in Excel format. We merged all into GIS so that everything is in one cohesive, streamlined data set. However, there were some walls, and I forget the number exactly, escapes me, something like 60,000 feet of wall that were not accounted for in GIS nor in the Excel files. And for that, we relied upon the city's financial records to account for those walls.
So, an additional question. What happened in 2004?
And it was not a Hurricane Charlie failure. Surprisingly enough, it moved through fast enough, it wasn't. But we had another mass failure. I checked with our finance folks and some other folks that had some historical knowledge. And sure enough, it was just one of those major failures like an Irma that came through at that time and took out a bunch of walls. So that's why that spike was there. It was in a storm response, but not Charlie.
And Gary, I mean, one of the things that I was missing in this is did we understand what the failure mode was in this? Was it toe kick? Was it, what is it that failed? And
Right.
have we solved the issue or problem for why these things fail as opposed to just old age?
And that data set we hadn't captured earlier on, but we have started to, like, especially with Irma, we captured all of the data set in regard to how those walls failed. And it's something that we're looking at as we're moving forward, because now that's an important factor. I think over 50% of the wall that failed during Irma was a toe kick out or bottom kick out. So we have that data now captured, whereas in the past we didn't. So we were definitely seeing, 50% of 10 miles was a toe kick out. So that was a substantial amount of those. Some of the other it was coded as a bottom kick out or toe kick out and a top lean. So part of the wall may have fallen forward as the other part kicked out, but it was captured as one location, so it was tagged with both of those. But that's broke down as well, along with just a top lean. But overarching, the one that was the major failure mode was for the toe to kick out.
Okay. Okay, but 2004 was probably some form of a rain event or storm?
It was a storm event, correct. Yep.
Okay.
Any other questions on this slide before we move on? So on this slide, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit, just kind of going back to the report so that we could be clear about the difference between design life and service life. And I'll have Cliff jump in here on this slide.
Again, this is in response to some of your specific comments and questions, and I'm hesitant to always in these situations to write down questions themselves because I end up then paraphrasing what you were asking. So if we don't get the question right, then please feel free to re-ask it and we'll have a discussion at the end. But in particular, somebody specifically asked, were we correctly identifying this as seawall study as opposed to a bulkhead? That's an interesting question because that gets used all the time in the press and in the public as it's a seawall kind of thing. There actually is a formal definition, goes back to the Corps of Engineers in 1984 version of the Shore Protection Manual, and they discuss retaining walls, bulkheads, and seawalls. They're all grade break structures. They're intended to separate one grade from the other. In the case of bulkheads and seawalls, water from the upland land mass. So what's the difference? It all comes down to what the emphasis that the designer placed on his design, particularly as it relates to wave action. So both seawalls and bulkheads are designed as retaining structures, and they're also designed to absorb or buffer some type of wave action, but it's the degree to which those two balance out. In the case of a bulkhead, the structure is primarily designed to retain the upland soil. It's incidentally designed for the hydrostatic and hydrodynamic wave forces. In a seawall, the emphasis is the other way around. The seawall is designed specifically to absorb wave action, and the upland retaining function is the secondary design. So technically speaking, I'm not critiquing the city attorney who did your enabling documents, but technically speaking, you have bulkheads, not seawalls, because they're not designed for wave action. So that comes up occasionally. You also ask what's the design life versus service life, and this is a little more subjective. The classic definition of that is design life is something the designer identifies, and he may be very conservative in that. He may say this structure is intended by my design to withstand the forces associated with that we expect over the next 25 years or 50 years or whatever it is. But in fact, we know that the service life, that structure may very well continue to function after that because of factors of safety, variations of material, the fact that in the design life, it never saw the loads that it was intended. So, classic example, worked on a project a long time ago, the waterfront in San Francisco. Timber piles had been installed in the 1920s. They were identified as having a 25-year design life. In 1980, they were functioning fine. They were pulled out by the Navy. They were in perfect condition. They could have been kept going for another 50 years. So your service life can frequently extend beyond the design life. So back to the question is, which one is the appropriate thing to use here? If we had used the design life, most designers would have said that the design of a bulkhead is something in the 25-year range. Maybe the materials supplier would say it's more than that, it's 40 years. But typically, we would say a bulkhead is a 25-year structure. If that was the case, then basically you would have exceeded the design life on all your structures. So the analysis essentially would have been kind of uninteresting. So really, we tried to look at as more the service life. This structure has already been in place 25 years. Now we're really beyond the design life, and we're into what we're trying to characterize as the service life. And that is a little bit more of a subjective discussion. You know, that's where the engineering judgment comes in, but does that answer the question why we don't use the design life? Because that's going to be a very conservative number, and you've probably exceeded the design life in all of these cases.
So with that, what we did was we took the data that I described already, the records that the city provided in GIS, the Excel version of those records, and their annual inspection reports, that record keeping, to come up with what the remaining service life of these walls is by their location, since they were all installed and replaced at different time periods. So this is just kind of a graphic that shows the results of that effort. On the y-axis, you can see the length of the seawall in feet. On the x-axis, the projected replacement year. It's small on my screen. I apologize if it is on yours, but you can see that I think the year 2020, you're well below your 8,000 feet per year threshold at this point. You're up below 5,000 feet, likely needing replacement under ambient conditions, barring any natural disasters or hurricanes. It's not really until you get to what appears to be 2027, in 7 years from now, you may see a spike where multiple walls on the order of, gosh, it's hard to see on here, my apologies, 50,000 feet may reach the end of their service life by definition of how we've defined that and calculated that for this purpose.
But now you're talking about all of Punta Gorda, not just BSI.
That's correct.
This a lot of this then is actually in PGI and not BSI.
Yes,
we're talking about.
Right, because your walls are newer then. That's true.
Yeah, and one quick thing to add to this, based on our 2019-20 data assessment, which we had just got this past year, but it was too late in the process because of all of the initial data processing that they went through with the earlier data set plus the IRMA data, we didn't incorporate the 2019-20 data in their study because we were too far down the road to do that. But just so you guys know, I ran this today, the different rebar types in the system, which was mentioned earlier, that kind of sets the age. And in your system, 3,000, let's just say 3,600 linear feet of epoxy coated wall. So that's what we call the 2010 and earlier replacement. MMFX, we were right at 13,000 feet, and unknown 78,400 feet. So you're over 82% of your system is original. So that, from that 1980 time period, we've got all that original wall still in place. And of that, we've identified monitor conditions on over 17,000 feet of that wall, which means it has some kind of a condition issue, some kind of crack, some kind of a visible on the surface issue.
So Gary, is it possible for that data to be covered over by that table 3.2? How, if we go back to the summary of the seawall ratings, is it possible to see that delineation that you've identified here by the rating from 2017?
I could go back in and run that for you guys if you'd like to see how each one of the monitor conditions comes into play. Is that what you're asking?
I guess what I'm trying to understand here is, how far can we kick the can, really? I mean, that's...
Right.
So you have 95,000 linear feet of wall in BSI, and you said, based on your most recent assessment, what percentage was in excellent to good?
I didn't do that analysis
I was
yet.
just trying to do that off the cuff here in comparison to.
Oh, gotcha, yeah. I was just looking at what we considered a wall action needed during our assessment. We went out, we either gave it a none, meaning it's good, leave it alone, a monitor, which means it has some kind of condition issue, we need to go out and take a look at that, or a replacement. So those were our three main items. We say a wall action needed, that's what it needs. And then we also classify the rebar that's in that segment. So I just did that analysis based on some of the comments as to, to kind of establish the age of the wall based on that, because that's our only real, only real way to say what it is, especially on the earlier walls.
Okay.
But that analysis there, breaking it down as to how we actually assessed it, what was rated a 1, what was rated a 2, 3, I can easily do that for you guys.
I think it would just help give us a better understanding of, how much of this is really aged and how that has impacted it. Or are some of the goods, walls that were originally installed, but just in very passive locations, say the end of a canal, doesn't get a lot of pressure.
Right. Yeah, and you guys have just under 61,000 feet of unknown, which would be original wall with no condition issues, visible condition issues. So of that, so you got 11.5 miles of, or 64% of your system, we determined in that 1920 assessment that did not have a condition issue.
Okay.
But as we've seen in some of the older sections in PGI, you get to that point where all of a sudden now we've all reached our, past design life. Yeah, the service life is reached, and you don't want to all of a sudden have 64% of your wall that needs to be replaced within a 5-10 year span when it all gets to that age.
Mm-hmm.
So just
I'm just going from the appendices here just to kind of dig a little deeper, I think, to what you're speaking to. But the average age of the wall in BSI appears to be around the order of 39 years, is where you're at now. And I did break down in that tables in Appendix D that you can see on the far left-hand column, the top 2 rows are BSI North and South.
Yeah.
And you'll see average year, the weighted installation average, installed weighted average year, what that amounts to in terms of the age of the wall. and then what the rating was for that length of wall under each of the categories 0 through 5. So the data itself is presented there, if that helps you to draw some comparisons.
And that was on the pre-IRMA data set.
Correct.
Blended with the IRMA replacements.
Right, so you'll notice that the IRMA replacements are captured in here, as did 0. Excellent. So,
Okay.
any other questions on this slide? Okay. So this graphic that you're looking at here is essentially the same data that was used to develop this cumulative plot that you see. And really, I think this plot is ultimately your planning tool right here, the basis, the foundation for your planning tool. So again, on the y-axis, you've got cumulative length of wall in feet. On the x-axis, projected replacement year. You can see there are a couple of peaks where the slope becomes much steeper, and then you've got some flatter sections of the slope. So, of course, it looks relatively flat, again, from year 2020, where we are today, out to about 2025, and then it starts to pick up up to 2030, and then again between 2030 and 2040. So you saw in the report, and I'll show it again on a future slide, some different ways that you could evaluate and analyze this plot, so we can come back to that. But there's any number of ways that you could look at this from a planning aspect moving forward on how you might consider modifying and budgeting those replacements. So another aspect of our scope, aside from the projections that we discussed, it was looking at alternatives. And I know there were some questions about, there's lots of different options out there in the world. What would maybe make a little bit more sense for BSI and for the program as a whole? And so this is just a table of all of the alternatives that we use lots of different places on lots of different projects and have a lot of experience in using, that we have looked at and considered for this project and for your area. But frankly speaking, these types of systems, whether it be composite systems or your true lines or those types of things, living seawalls, for example, those really should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, and it's very challenging to take a design like that and apply it to 109 miles of wall. So for that reason, we really narrowed it down to what we called 3 primary alternatives for consideration. And the first 2 are a variation of your current design with some recommendations. And so the details of those alternatives were more explicit in the report, but just as a quick summary here, option 1 would be what we can call the modified concrete panel design, wherein you maintain the use of the high-strength silica fume concrete that the city is currently using, and maintain the use of MMFX rebar with some changes to the rebar size, for example, some minor tweaks to where you might place weep poles for better hydrostatic pressure relief, and then namely some changes to the curing process. Option 2 was similar to that, modified concrete design, panel design, using, however, stainless steel reinforcement rather than the MMFX. And again, the reason for that is that we felt like when you're dealing with concrete walls and panel design, the main thing you're concerned about as a designer is cracking in the concrete. And the only way to prevent cracking is through the reinforcing steel. And so that is really the critical element in order to eliminate the chloride intrusion, because concrete cracks. It's just going to crack. Once that concrete cracks, you want to be sure that whatever's in the center holding it together is strong. And so that was the purpose for the consideration to move potentially to stainless steel. However, we recognize that stainless steel can be very expensive. And in order to help try to offset those costs, we really kind of took another deeper look at the use of the high-strength concrete, which was a very good selection on the city's part, actually. It's a great material, but it does take time to properly cure the type of concrete that's being used. And so if you go up in strength and size with stainless steel reinforcement, you can save some costs by going down to your standard 4,000 PSI concrete and eliminate the use of the high strength, which would help out with some of that production and the actual fabrication of the panels themselves. A third option that we looked at that for consideration is vinyl. And again, maintaining the use of MMFX tie rods and tiebacks. And then the graphic you see here is just pulled from the city's standard waterfront design drawings. So coming into the conclusions here, there were 4 overall study recommendations to modify the structural design modifications. I just went through those 3. And what I did here is just summarized those for you in terms of their cost. So you can see the material on the left-hand column, current concrete design, what the city is currently paying per linear foot for installed. The modified concrete design, option 1, where you would maintain the use of the high-strength concrete. Modified concrete design with stainless steel reinforcement going down to the 4,000 PSI concrete, and then of course vinyl. So what jumps out in the very next column is the cost per linear foot. You can see that there's a wide range, $317 round numbers per foot, up to $428 per foot. That's a big jump to go to stainless steel on the front end, and we fully recognize that. However, when you look at the life cycle costs, and we normalized what those life cycles would be over a 90-year period, then you start to see where this benefit comes into play. Going from $571 per foot of wall and dropping that down over the lifespan of $428 per foot.
Another cost to this is the removal of all this concrete.
Correct.
I guess you're aware we're running out of staging lots, so we have to barge this stuff in and out potentially in the future, which is going to raise that price a lot higher, I imagine.
We did try to capture that actually because the city's numbers did include the demolition, so that we just kept that cost here as well for all of those options.
So the removal of the cement walls,
That's correct.
is that in that figure?
Yes, sir.
To farm it out to whatever marina or wherever?
With no escalation.
No
it's just
escalation,
whatever
right.
the city had used.
Right.
That's
Oh,
it.
had used in the past, which was empty lots, which we won't be having.
Right. But we touch on that, and that third bullet there is looking at future construction staging and barge transport access.
Okay.
We certainly recognize that's becoming a growing concern. And we did look at some possibilities there for partnerships with other, like a local marina here, potentially taking advantage of the city-owned lot at Colony Point and making use of that for staging and stockpiling of some material, with some cost there in the report as well. The third overall study recommendation was, again, the potential modification to the seawall production and replacement rates. So going back to that linear plot that we looked at a few slides back, there are a number of ways to slice that plot. We chose to show 2 in the report as an example, but of course that's a city financing effort that, of course, they would be able to delve into those numbers much deeper than we would. But just as an example, if you were to take from fiscal year 2020 today, projected out to 2040, and you wanted to have the same set budget every year, just as you do now, you would need to essentially more than double that current production rate up to 17,500 feet per year, based on the remaining service life that we calculated on the data we used. Another example to break that down a little further, maybe ramping up to that, is the stepped type of option where you start over the course of the next 10 years, only bumping it up to 12,500 feet per year. Maybe that's a little more manageable than going more than double. And then, all the while planning on, again, ramping up to 22,500 feet per year between fiscal year 2030 and 2040. Again, you could increase it 2,000 feet per year over the whole next 20 years or so. It's really just what the budget numbers look like for you all and for the city and what makes the most sense.
And I guess to try to wrap that back into what Burnt Store's portion is, typically we replace about 8,000 feet a year. Y'all's portion is about 1,000 feet of that. So, 1/8 of it. So if we go up to 17,000 instead of our normal 8,000 or 1,000 feet, we're 2,000 feet. So that is, I guess, kind of brings it back to y'all's subdivision. And then those were estimated costs not based on a final design, because we didn't want to go into contract with them to do final design, final makeup, exactly where the steel lands, for all the different scenarios, because we don't yet know what's going to be chosen by the city for a final, which one of the options do they want to go with. So we did not have that in the scope to do a final, peg down design until we had a grasp on which direction council was going to take.
I think it's one of my thoughts here, and maybe I'm not thinking it right. I mean, these are your projections on wall failure, correct? Based on history and whatever else goes into it.
Not entirely failure, because we're trying to get proactive so you don't run into that situation where
okay.
all the walls fail in the same year.
But at the same time, if you go out and inspect a wall and it's in good condition, even though it has met that number, do we go ahead and automatically replace it? I don't know that I would be in favor of that, to replace something that is substantially good. Sure. Making the assumption that 5 years, 10 years down the road, you may have some additional failures out there. Mm-hmm. And that's, to me, that's being a bit presumptuous, I think. And how do we balance that? And not, if we end up saying that as a community we need to increase the funding that we're paying out in the form of a tax, to me it doesn't make sense to replace a good wall, with something just based upon, well, we think it's going to fail in the next 5 years and we're going to be proactive, when it might be better to put that in some funds someplace and have that available if, God forbid, a catastrophe happens and you got to replace, right. 3 or 4 times our normal rate, or whatever the case is.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
That's kind of what I'm thinking.
But bank the money to fix it.
Yeah, as long as we maybe have some money out there. But I would hate to get into saying, well, okay, we've met this life expectancy on this wall, whether it's service life or actual life, whatever the case is, but it's still a good wall because there's no cracks in there. The corrosion has not occurred within the bar because salt hasn't got into that. The concrete itself is showing some flaking, some deterioration, but it's still structurally a sound wall. It doesn't make any sense to me to replace that wall. And I'm rambling, I know, and I apologize, but I don't know. I don't want to put a lot of fear out there, but at the same time, I think it's good to discuss these points. So I'll stop right there.
And remember now, as of our last assessment, you'll have just over 17 years worth of replacement at the current 1,000 feet a year. And if we're at 39 years now, by the time we get what we've already identified as cracked wall out of the system at 1,000 feet a year, we're 17 years down the line. We're approaching a 50-year life.
Right.
Good chance that some of the nuns are going to become into the monitors by that time.
Yeah, I understand all that, Gary. I mean, I really do.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway.
It makes total sense to not, like I said, it's not broke, don't fix it, but yet we have to make sure that as stewards of the seawall system, we don't let it get to a point where, we got angry folks showing up, hey, why didn't you guys look in the future and, plan on these walls failing, so.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, building on that, one of the things that struck me is in watching these folks replace these seawalls, getting rid of the concrete is certainly an issue. And, we have some heavy, big panels, but that's a piece of it. But it occurs to me that the bulk of the effort really goes into excavating behind that wall, going all the way back to the dead man or the tie back there. And I was intrigued, given the large degree of homes that are sitting on these things that have failed, that we still think that going in, taking out the trees, taking out, everything back to 10 or some cases 15 feet to do this, that it's right to excavate it versus looking at some of the more modern, which you touched on, the helical anchors, where it seems to me you don't have to. And I'm not an expert in this. I'm just an outside observer watching this. But basically, they've been using those as anchors up in the Northeast, getting rid of mushrooms for 20 years now. it seems to me that the technology for installing these, even in deep water, is pretty damn good. And you wouldn't have to excavate as much. We
Right.
don't have that issue of having to stage material and land as a result of that. I mean, I was just missing that in this whole report.
You do trade a little bit of one thing for another. We've not used helical anchors horizontally for bulkhead, although we use helical anchors as pullouts for moorings all the time. On the other hand, there is a different type of anchor. It's a proprietary brand name called a Manta anchor, which basically goes in and then flukes out. And I have used those. In fact, I've used those in Sarasota for vinyl bulkhead. That technology is pretty well established, and it could be something that you might want to try on a demonstration basis. The trade-off, though, is that your contractor needs to be pretty well trained up on how to use Manta anchors. You have to do a pull-out test on those,
Or
because
any anchor really for that.
any anchor, you have to do some type of active pull-out to be sure that you've developed the soil resistance that you need. When you do a dead man, you're basically going on 100 years of experience. It's this big, it weighs that, and we assume the soil is okay. If you're using any type of inserted anchor, though, you basically have to tension that thing until you get the intended reaction to it. Now, that's not something that's insurmountable, but that's something your typical local contractor, seawall contractor, doesn't do. He doesn't have the jack system and the reaction barge and all that to do that. Can do it, but it certainly avoids exactly what you're saying. Avoids tearing up. On the other hand, you have utilities, things that are in there anyway that you're going to have problems with the anchors. I think it's a nice clean system. It's not automatically cheaper, but it certainly, on selected cases where you have a lot of upland infrastructure, heck, we have swimming pools where people cut the anchors, cut the tieback rods to put the pool in. We see that in Longboat Key. So those types of situations, you're stuck with some other type of design, either cantilever or some type of pull-out system.
You mentioned piling specifically in your report as an alternative, and
Right.
that's good. Obviously, driving pile close to a house sometimes has its own considerations. I've worked with piers, drilled piers in the past with a whole lot better success, a lot less disturbance to the areas and that sort of thing.
I wanted to emphasize one thing, as long as I'm standing here talking, that Gary said, is we actually were, I hate when a consultant does this, and I'm about to do it anyway, but we were not actually contracted to look at the design. We were basically intended to make comments on what the city was doing, not to really redesign it. And all that said, I love talking about concrete. The first job I had as an engineer was breaking compressive strength cylinders in the lab, so I'm happy to stand here and talk about it, but really we're not redesigning this system for the city. That may or may not be something that the city wants to look at, but that's really not the intent of this. So I'm going to try to answer questions that you have about that. Some of you were very detailed in your questions about the design, and again, we can talk philosophically about different designs, but really we did not redesign these panels.
Right, these are just intended to be order of magnitude
Order of
costs
magnitude.
for alternatives that we felt were most viable for this project.
And the good thing is we do have history with manta rays. MCG puts them in currently on some of our tight spots where we can't get in with a typical deadman situation, so we have installed them in the past. The city in general has experience with the helical, which is basically a giant screw. We use those on Buckley's Pass, and so they would put an extension bar in, run the gauge, you watch your gauge, watch your pressure come up. If you're, okay, we need to throw another stick on. And, I think a minimum of 17 feet may have been the number, out to however many plates you need to put on until you reach that pullback. Mm-hmm. So some of those, it's just, kind of a crapshoot, what's in the soil below and how far you can go.
Exactly.
And that goes back to that construction versus the design. When the designer is designing it, they'll be specifying what that anchor length should be based on geotechnical data on a site-by-site scenario typically.
So, and here we're shotgunning 109 miles of site, and so it's we've got to make I guess a broad brush stroke to cover all bases and be safe everywhere is how we would normally go about it. Unless we get into some areas like, which doesn't apply to you guys, the bird section. They got a lot more rockier, harder area compared to some of the others. So maybe you tailor a site. If we've got soil conditions down here, we'll do something a little different. Your guys' area seems to hold up pretty well as well. May have totally different soil classifications down in the subdivision there that we could look at for a site-specific design for your subdivision.
Okay.
But that was a future authorization that we would get to after we, came up with an idea on which direction to run this thing.
Yeah, I worry again at that, are the numbers, 44 to $120 a foot adder when you start running out of places to do this. Mm-hmm. And my question is, why do we have to barge out dirt that we're going to be putting back, or so much of the dirt that we're going to be putting back? Is there a compromise in there, if you will?
Well, we've had that experience with one of our seawall contractors during Irma. They did not barge dirt away. They piled the dirt up as high as they needed to until it reached the pool deck, and it was pretty much a full redo on the backyards. Whereas, normally the folks are used to, I want a 6 foot, 8 foot trench in my backyard and that's it. Leave my flowers alone. But, that particular contractor came in, dug it and stacked, and they just piled it up, and that's how they did business. So we've got experience with folks leaving, the dirt right behind the excavation. So, like I said, we've had to cover a lot of bases, especially due to Irma. So we've seen a lot of new things.
Well, it's going to end up as a cost discussion. I mean, this is
everything.
And you're touching on a kind of a fine line there too, because we would call that contractors' means and methods. So if it's a messy demolition, for example, and they're mixing the concrete in with the soil, then you could require them to screen it in order to use that same material on the site to be sure there's no debris in that backfill, because that's an important aspect to the design as a whole, versus them just maybe being a little more carefree about how they demo it and scooping it all just because it's easier to get it off the site in a timely fashion. That's something that you could play with the specifications on that, if there was a real cost savings there on a case-by-case basis or in a neighborhood or a zone.
And those are unforeseen until we go out on the street for a bid. All in all, we got to do our best job. We never saw, I guess we had not experienced someone staging the dirt on the site like that in the past, only on a vacant lot. So we didn't have that written out of the scope when we went out on the street for Irma, so that caught us by surprise when residents are freaking out, calling us, hey, I've got dirt stacked up, 10 feet tall in my backyard. What are we going to do about it? So, but it was a learning experience we've chalked up for sure.
So no question or discussion about construction staging and barge transport. We discussed a number of options. This is a challenge, a very real challenge that I think is going to have to require some additional exploration. There is no silver bullet in this report. Again, this was a feasibility study to look at options and order of magnitude costs and possibilities that we felt were most viable. And again, that could vary on neighborhood by neighborhood.
And if we get the south side of the lock opened up, that's something that we've talked about, being able to pull a fully loaded barge in and out of the subdivision then. We've got Buckley's Pass open now, and we're talking about opening up a potential pass or a cut through to the Colony Point staging site, which has been out there as well. So we would be able to run a fully loaded barge to a so-called location to offload it if we ran out of staging lots. Or not if, when we run out of staging lots. And we know that nobody wants to have a staging lot next door to their house, in the subdivision. And we've already ran that by several times on a fairly unpopular option to purchase lots. So.
Very unpopular.
Yes, very.
Like, not fairly, it was very unpopular.
Yes.
Understood. And so just kind of bringing it back to the fourth and final kind of overarching recommendation then that we gleaned from all of this was taking again a look at the inspection record. So the city's been very proactive in how they've done the record keeping, which is no easy task for 109 miles of wall that are replaced on an annual basis under some program in addition to annual inspections. It's a lot of information. And as with all inspections across the board, whether it be engineering inspections of any nature, there's some level of subjectivity in there, and it really comes down to the inspector, their level of background and knowledge, and their record keeping, really. So there is some discrepancies or variability in some of that data, and that's just inherent in the nature of this type of work. But we did take a look at that, and we really relied heavily on that to develop those projections. But we felt that in the process of reviewing that data to the degree that we did, that there could be some streamlining that the city might consider for cost savings and to kind of try to reduce some of the subjectivity that's inherent in these types of evaluations. And so one option for consideration that we use in-house, and it is used widely by the Army Corps of Engineers, they also have their own version of this. NAVFAC and the Navy has a version of this as well. There are a number of different published manuals out there, but the one that we use that's most common, and we use it on our contracts with the U.S. Coast Guard as well, nationwide, is the ASCE. It's American Society of Civil Engineering has published a waterfront facilities and inspection assessment report manual. And it's very detailed in what they classify as level 1 versus a level 2 inspection, level 1 being kind of a walk by or a swim by, which it sounds as though is traditionally used by the city and also by us as well when we go out to do a site-specific seawall or bulkhead inspection. Just taking notes and photos and measurements of the cracks, the type of crack, whether it's longitudinal versus transverse, all of those things, the cracking patterns really tell a story. And this manual helps you to kind of hone in on what that story is, what this is, how serious is this crack. And it's an element by element look at that, to the degree of which there's been some degradation there. Level 2 inspection is what we define as a partial removal of marine growth or the oysters that you see on the bottom. If there's a problem that you think needs some further investigating, that's another layer that you can drill down into. A lot of times when we do these on large facilities, we'll do them randomly. We'll just state on the outset that we're going to do this every 30 feet or every 100 feet. We'll do a level 2 just as a cross-check. And then you use this manual will walk you through how to develop then the overall structure rating. And it's very similar to what the city uses. They use a 1 through 5. The city uses a 0 through 5 with some minor nuances in how those are defined. But the whole point, again, is to try to eliminate some of that subjectivity that you have from one inspector to another over the years. There is, we talked a little bit about the costs to do that. There are some options that we described in the report for implementing something like this if that were of interest. And there are training programs. We send our guys. I went to a short course. You spend 3-4 days in a short course, and you can get a really good handle on this type of what's required in the manual and the process that's used. Another thing we looked at is that the city is, again, really on top of it. They're looking at these things every single year. That's not easy. Even the Coast Guard, where we work with them quite a bit, they only inspect their structures every 4 to 5 years. Same with the Navy. There's not many folks out there looking at their structures every single year. There could be some significant cost savings there, which would free up those man hours to really focus on your problem areas and condense some of that data gathering. So that was the fourth and final kind of overarching recommendation there for some consideration. And the photo on the bottom that you see is, again, just the different crack patterns for what they consider poor, minor, major, and so on. So just kind of a neat graphic that helps break that down. And my last slide is, again, what we talked about. We did go through the comments that were provided both by you folks from BSI as well as PGI and tried to kind of group them, if you will, into question or discussion topics. So we put them here, again, for fear of not wanting to put words in your mouth, but just to touch on them, we can walk through them one by one, or we can raise some additional comments from you. But I appreciate your time.
And this is really at your discretion. We're 50 minutes into the advertised 20-minute presentation. I've tried to touch on at least 3 or 4 of the specific questions. So again, this is entirely up to how you want to proceed here. If you have specific questions in your comments that you want me to respond to, I'll do my best to do that. The challenge we have in all of these types of situations is somebody made one comment, somebody made the other comment. Those 2 comments are opposite sides of it, so I don't know which one to answer. A lot of what you ask, understandably and properly, really were questions for the city, not so much for Taylor Engineering. But to the extent we didn't cover what you want to know, ask now.
I think it's bullet point 4 here. It talks about failure modes. We've talked about that in various forms today already, but failure modes I think is very important. Maybe Gary, you might want to look at this a little bit more. Is we talked about the kick out issue being a failure mode. We talked about cracking of the concrete being a failure mode, but how often does that cracking result in a failed panel? I guess that's where I'm going to. I understand all of the chlorides getting in and deteriorating the rebar and that sort of thing, but as a percent, the failures of the panels that required replacement, is it 70% kick out? Is it 70% cracking that leads to panel failure? Or are there other issues? The dead man, the anchoring system itself failed behind it that causes this. I'd like to have a little bit better feel for that.
Gary and Jenna have a better sense of the numbers. I'll tell you in general, 40 years of experience, I've probably seen this many examples of a wall that failed where a concrete panel literally cracked through the middle in shear.
That's what I'm wondering about. That
that's
gets down
very
to my
unusual.
question. Right.
The most common cracking failure is in the cap itself, where the concrete
Right.
falls.
I agree with you on that
The
too.
cap
I've seen most
basically
of that.
deteriorates, the panels start to move, and then you precipitate a soil failure from behind because you're allowing the panels to move relative to, and open up the joints.
Right.
So that's a cracking failure, but it's not cracking in the panels.
Right.
So beyond that, though, next layer, though, is without question, I see all the time longitudinal and transverse cracks in the panels that are not shear problems, but they do allow for the intrusion of the chlorides, and then you see spalling that takes place as a result of the corrosion. Now, at what point is that a failure? No, the panel doesn't go like that and break literally in the middle.
No.
But it does spall.
Right.
And it is then more susceptible to movement and potential cap out or toe out types of failures.
Right.
So,
But from a structural perspective, though, the
Very
panels are
rare.
in pretty good condition,
very
even though they're
rare.
spalled and they're showing wear.
I didn't say that cracking is not a problem.
Right. I didn't
It's
either.
very
I
much
just-
a problem.
yeah.
But it almost never do you see a shear failure in a concrete
Right.
panel.
Okay.
And that's something we talked a lot about when we looked at these individual elements, whether it be just tie rods, just the reinforcing steel, is that you want to look at those features element by element in an inspection, but then you really need to step back from it and look at it as a system.
Right.
The design of the system.
Exactly. And I guess where I'm coming from on that is we talk about stainless steel, we talk about some of these other issues for reinforcement when the failures are not generally from reinforcement, it's from the cracking that's allowing the intrusion of chlorides into those steel components.
But
So
in
maybe
fact,
it'd be
your
better.
stainless steel reduces that because the stainless steel is less susceptible to the subsequent corrosion and spall.
But you still got spalling going on. If you
The less corrosion you have, the less spalling you have. Because typically it's the expansion of the steel from the corrosion, the scaling of the rebar from the corrosion that causes the concrete to push out and break, basically, spall. So it's not so much that one type of steel over another type of steel is going to stop the cracking. The amount of steel may do that, but the type of steel certainly doesn't do that. All concrete cracks in the marine environment. There's no question about it. It's how do you control what happens after it cracks that is really the focus of using epoxy or MMFS or stainless steel.
Right.
It's really what happens downstream after the cracking and the chloride intrusion takes place.
And just to add to that about the nature of steel and that, how it does expand, it's the same concept when you look at steel walls, steel bulkheads that start to swell. They appear as though they're swelling. They look hideous, but in fact, they're a very well designed wall. They were just designed to corrode in that way, and the designer
Right.
more than likely expect a certain thickness because they knew that would occur because that's the behavior of steel.
Right.
So it's the same inside of concrete.
Right. I don't. It's not my intent to argue with you in the sense. It's really it's looking at what happens. It's a definitional thing. Does cracking precipitate a failure? It doesn't precipitate a shear failure, but cracking basically allows chloride intrusion. If you don't have the right type of steel, the steel corrodes, the swelling of the steel spalls the concrete, that weakens the cross-section, and then that panel is more susceptible to subsequent movement and bending moments and toe out. So it's a chain reaction, as she said. You have to look at the whole system.
I agree on that.
And maybe Gary knows how many linear feet.
Right, yeah. I'm not sure if I can switch this over without totally losing our spot. Jump over to... Just to show you guys what we had going on. And like I said, this isn't anything that we thought we never really captured a lump sum data set like this before, so we did it during Irma. So we sent the crews out and we walked every single one of these walls, and for example, we've got burn store north. The failure types are subtotal of the lengths, the percentage in comparison to the overall for the failures themselves. And then I've got the existing rebar classifications of epoxy coated, our MMFX, our unknowns, and mangroves, meaning they couldn't assess.
We're not getting those.
They're not seeing it.
We're not seeing that, Gary.
Oh, you're not seeing that?
No, we're not.
It's not coming up.
How could we switch that over?
It flickered.
Okay, yeah, let's,
There we go.
can y'all see that now?
That's it.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. And like I
Okay.
said, this was a one-time snapshot thing that we were able to capture during Irma. So we've got all of the different types of kickouts. Let's see if I can slide this up enough so we can get some definitions. Well, I'll just run up here real quick. So here's our BKO bottom kickout, BLO bottom leaning out, OLB oyster line break, TL top lean, U is unknown. So I guess for a representative set here, we'll run back up here, burn store north. You can see bottom kickout, 51% of the burn store north failures were bottom kickout. OLB, oyster line break, this comes down to probably cracks that we couldn't see buried behind the oysters.
Right.
That spalling occurred, that loss of section.
So that would be a structural failure to me.
Structural failure.
Yeah, okay, I agree with you on that.
19% of it was oyster line break.
Yeah.
Top lean was the other 25.8, which could have been cap deterioration, cap opened up, it broke free, did the dead men slide,
Dead
the
men,
hydrated
yeah,
soil. So out of that zone, all the, we categorize all of these in the data set throughout PGI and BSI. So any of these combinations were in some place in the system. When we go down to the south zone, bottom kick out 30%. We had a combination of bottom kick out and oyster line break, 7%. Oyster line break 50%, top lean 10%, and then unassigned 2.8. So overwhelmingly, we had either bottom kick out, that spalling at the oyster line that split open, or a minor side on the top lean. So we've kind of, I guess, identified what had failed or how it failed one snapshot in time during Irma.
That's good.
Yeah, which is great, and you know, by the data that you have there, the 2004, which you mentioned, and then we saw Irma, I mean, we had a tremendous amount of water.
Right.
You know, so for me, what that says is we've got huge amounts of hydrostatic pressure pressing on these walls. You know, are there some fixes beyond throwing a burlap bag filled with gravel behind the weep hole? I mean, that's kind of...
Yeah, and I think maybe somebody asked about the idea of permanent dewatering systems or dewatering system behind the wall. And that's, I'm not sure how that would work. Typically, we relieve the hydrostatic pressure by weep holes. A dewatering system would have to be passive burlap bags. You couldn't have an active dewatering system like pumps or well points or something like that. And again, there's an unintended problem here is in this type of situation, your panels are not in any sense waterproof. So when you dewater behind the wall, what do you do with the water? You put it back in the canal. So all you're doing is recycling it. You're not really changing the differential pressure permanently over any period of time anyway. So, you know, again, you typically deal with hydrostatic pressure by designing for it in the cross-section of the wall or by providing weep holes to release it. They also try to keep people from adding water behind there, keep stormwater from ponding and sprinkler systems and all that kind of stuff.
And actually, I think we put, or Kathy put, the town put a fairly good community standards, it's more than a pamphlet, a booklet out there, and I think most of the contractors within the town have been made aware of this and are paying attention to do this, but, you know.
If you have a toe kick out, there can be some hydrostatic component to that, but toe kick out is usually embedment issue. That's a lack of passive confinement at the toe.
And maybe when they originally installed these walls, we've talked about it in the past, 40, 50 years ago, they put these walls in. They used 8-foot panels. Maybe there was only 5 feet down to the berm. Over time, boats, tidal action has pulled those berms off, and now you've got embedment. Obviously, we've got some areas that we have, 6 inches of embedment. We have an Irma that comes through and blows all the water out of the harbor. Hydrated soil, there's just nothing holding that toe in. So the tiebacks hold on top, and out goes the bottoms.
So again, Gary, this is all very good and great discussions, but we're talking a lot of money.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of money.
Armoring the toe, we've talked some about that, just, putting riprap in. I may not have an easy time getting through National Marine Fisheries with that one because that's all considered small tooth zone, but the small tooth sawfish, but that kind of armoring would help keep the toes from kicking out. Right after the storm, I ran that analysis and showed we had wall failures that ran right up and stopped where we had riprap. So even out on the harbor where we've got all the worst wave action, I know it's not y'all's subdivision, but Tropicana, Jamaica Way, all those points out there, almost all of its original wall, all armored with riprap. We haven't had to change it. And there it is, the worst abuse in the whole system, and it's still there. But armored probably since day one. So its berm is kept in place, and the energy of those waves gets dissipated by the riprap.
Mm-hmm. That's PGI.
That's PGI, though.
Yeah.
We're talking BSI.
Right. But just giving that as an example
Yeah.
we had,
Most of our panels are deeper and longer than many of the ones in PGI originally. There's a difference.
Yeah, I think all the original wall was at the 8-foot level. Well, most of the identified original wall that we pulled, it was a normal 4-inch thick cross section, 8 foot tall, anywhere between 4 and 6 foot wide, 4, 5s, and 6s. Your guys' subdivision was the latest year, so it was all full 6-foot panels, weep holes. Some of the older northern sections didn't have, and PGI, of course, didn't have weeps, but you guys all have weeps throughout, so that and then the full 8-foot section, or 8-foot length.
Gary, where are the tie
Oh, would you be able to hit the mic?
Yeah, quickly, where are the tiebacks located on the panel? Are they at the top, at the middle, or at the bottom?
All of our tiebacks are tied into the hairpins on the panels. So they got the J-bar that hooks into the top of the panel and then back down to the dead men block in the soil.
It's within the cap.
It's within the cap.
Move that down towards the middle
That would be a design question, so.
to stop the toe from kicking out?
That's not usually what causes the toe to kick out. If the toe kicks out, the top is properly or adequately restrained. So if you're holding the top and the toe kicks out, it's because the panel is going waterward because of lack of soil confinement there.
But he's talking about a secondary tieback. Yeah,
A second two tiebacks?
Yeah.
Maybe a tougher install,
That would
because
be
right
a
now
tougher installation.
we have an exposure of
Right.
the actual hairpin. So we've got a complete sealed unit all the way, supposedly sealed from the cap down to the bottom of the panel. We would have to then window or drill through that in order to put some kind of a restrictive plate or hook into and then mud that shut. We wouldn't have it.
Excuse me, I'm going to interrupt you. If you, as a recording secretary, I can't hear your questions, so please come to the podium. If you're going to ask any more questions, if you're not going to say anything, stay where you are.
Anyway, again, some more questions. New sheets in front of the old sheets, somebody asked about that. That's perfectly viable. We do that a lot of times where you don't want to disturb the upland. You have to deal with how to get the new tiebacks through the old wall. I'm not a huge fan of that. I've done it. I've seen it done. My problem is you need to go in opposite directions. Either the old wall and the new wall need to be absolutely structurally separate so that movement in one does not affect the other, or they need to be absolutely structurally connected so that they're designed as a system. The last thing you want is, yeah, they kind of work together, but we're not really sure how that happens. So it can be done. It's good from a regulatory standpoint. It's good for the contractor, basically. It's easy to put new sheets in front of them.
How does it fit with the homeowners in the area? If you put a wall a couple of feet further out and so forth and so on, I can
Not
imagine
typically a
the
couple of feet. It's
hysteria that would.
less than a foot. But you can get a DEP permit to do that, which is one of the advantages of it.
See if she asks.
Katrina McIntosh, the next addition to that would be, then would it be on the homeowner, because now my dock's in the way of putting a wall in front of the old one and my lift
Absolutely.
and...
Absolutely, and the dock situation came up, and I don't have a solution for that. Absolutely. But it's not infeasible to do that. There's some regulatory, some permitting advantages to doing that, but you have to design for it. We talked about pile anchors a little bit already, and the cost implications about the projections, you discussed that a little bit. Those are really, if you say that's a balancing question, is at what point are you replacing something that today doesn't need replacing, but you don't know when it's going to need replacing. So again, it's prudence in terms of budgeting so that you're prepared for slug, the pig coming through the python type of budget. Any other questions? Again, I'm happy to talk about steel, concrete. Then thank you very much.
Thank you for your
Thank
time. Appreciate it.
Any other questions, staff? Citizens' comments? Staff comments? Nobody? I guess we're adjourned.
Where do we go from here?
I guess as an update, or as a follow-up to this, we've got, this same presentation is going to be given to PGI next week. And, next page here. And then tentatively, September 23rd is, we're looking at going in front of City Council with the same presentation. After that, then we will take the notes from every, all the folks that have submitted notes and comments during the meetings and after, and what comes out of that. A final report will then be produced, kind of blending what we can blend of all of those items into a final report, which will then be submitted back out.
So, Gary, we can still go on, Mike, right?
Yeah.
As part of this presentation to City Council, I think it would be very useful to have Kristen or somebody within the town put together a pro forma that says, here's what this means. All right? And I communicated
Oh, you did, yeah.
my pro forma
Excellent.
on
Yeah.
this to you, and I think, I don't know how far off I am. I don't think I'm off by much.
But
That's going to really shake up some people. If this is the path that's chosen, there's a very heavy burden on everybody here to be communicating this within the community on this is what's facing us, and here's what we have done to try and mitigate it and manage this, and this is still the best option. Because people are going to go ballistic.
Right. Yeah, and it's just one of those things that's, I know nobody likes to have unpleasant conversations about stuff like this, but if we don't talk about it now and get it on our radar and have these discussions on how we're going to take care of it, then, in the future, the next set of folks that come through aren't going to be happy with us for letting it get too far gone before we take advantage of it. But I will definitely bring that up to finance and see what she can put together performance. I'll send your information on to her as well and see what she can come up with in regard to the numbers that were presented today, how that affects them.
Okay. I just think we need to, it's good to talk about these numbers in terms of, the cost per linear foot has gone up from this to this. But really the question is, there's two questions. One, can individuals absorb the increase that you're talking about? And the second question, quite honestly, is 90 years the right timeline to be using as a payback for folks that are here for 10 to 15. I mean, that's just, that's a tough sell.
Right. I understand. A decision that has to be made, obviously, across the board, so. But do we want to put in a 40-year product and turn around in 40 years and do it again? I know that's part of the thought process of, how many times do you go through it?
Boy, that'd be an interesting question to ask the population.
Right, okay. But yeah, I'll see about how we can put that together, maybe come up with another threshold or another time frame or something for payback.
Yeah, I'm not questioning what you've
Right.
got out there. You guys are the experts who put that together. But I think those three issues, did we ask the right question? Did we spend enough time on a solution really looking in depth that, this is the optimal solution for the problem we have, which is the disappearance of staging lots? Mm-hmm. And the third question is, can we afford it?
Sounds good.
Any other questions? Anyone? Nobody? Well, I guess we're adjourned then.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I will be here next month.
So I'll put that information in.
I think they're being,
I see what you were saying. That's why I got up and said something. You put a seawall. I understand what you were saying. That's why I got up and said something. You put a seawall in front of my existing seawall. I gotta pay for my new dock. I gotta pay for new lift. People aren't gonna go for it.
Look across the canal and see somebody
For the next one.
Maybe before council. Yes.
We talked a little bit about that.
Right.
Sounded like the solution is really, sound like the solution is really to the rebar from that.
Right.
They've got some of the original still stands.
And our push bike is so very, like I said, something in different directions, it's hard to.
You got the rebar. You've got the riprap in there. That's in the bottom, that keep, you don't need that pipe back in the bottom.
Right. I don't know.
If we took all that rubble and stuff.